Other PSD and Title V requirements for greenhouse gases. First, we'll cover other aspects of PSD implementation. Normally, under PSD, there is a requirement to evaluate the impacts of the facility on compliance with the National Ambient Air Quality Standards and the PSD increments. From our guidance document, we mentioned that since no NAAQS or PSD increments exist for greenhouse gases, PSD applicants are not required to model greenhouse gases or conduct ambient monitoring for greenhouse gases. Further, while greenhouse gases induce warming and impact the environment, including on Class 1 areas and soils and vegetation, it is not feasible with current climate change modeling to detect and attribute such impacts to a specific source of greenhouse gases within the context of a PSD review, permit review. So now we'll cover Title V permitting. A Title V permit must contain conditions necessary to ensure compliance with applicable requirements for greenhouse gases. For example, PSD permit conditions. Title V applications, including permit revision, reopening, or renewal, are required to provide emissions information for all pollutants for which the source is considered major. Under Step 1 of the tailoring rule, a new or modified stationary source cannot be major solely on the basis of greenhouse gas emissions. So not all Title V permit applicants are required to provide greenhouse gas emissions information. Note, however, that under Step 1 for sources that are subject to or that become newly subject to Title V for non-greenhouse gas pollutants, which would be what we call anyway sources, sources and permitting authorities need to meet the generally applicable Title V application and permitting requirements as necessary to address the greenhouse gas applicable requirements that are established under other Clean Air Act programs. It is expected, at least at the outset, that this will consist primarily of meeting application and permitting requirements necessary to assure compliance with the PSD permitting requirements for greenhouse gases. And finally, a permitting authority can request greenhouse gas emissions information from the applicant to verify that PSD was not triggered by a greenhouse gas emission source. Okay, under Step 2 of the tailoring rule, a stationary source can be major solely on the basis of its greenhouse gas emissions, assuming it exceeds or at least has 100,000 tons per year of CO2e or it exceeds that amount of that threshold. So permitting applicants over the threshold must provide greenhouse gas emissions data in addition to any information for other air pollutants for which they are major. Particularly in cases where there are no applicable requirements for the greenhouse gas emission source, a description of the source instead of an emissions estimate may be sufficient. And we reference here the 1995 Title V Policy Guidance, White Paper number 1, that would give some guidance on that. Sources that are newly subject to Title V solely because of greenhouse gas emissions will still need to provide required information for all applicable requirements under the Clean Air Act, which could include, for example, requirements that are contained within a SIP. Appropriately, for other applicable requirements, monitoring, record-keeping, and reporting conditions will be required for those requirements. Also, in Step 2, as under Step 1, for all anyway sources subject to Title V, sources and permitting authorities need to meet the generally applicable Title V application and permitting requirements as necessary to address the greenhouse gas applicable requirements that are established under other Clean Air Act programs, such as the PSD program. Likewise, as in Step 1, it is expected, at least at the outset, that this will consist primarily of meeting application and permitting requirements that are necessary to assure compliance with PSD permitting requirements for greenhouse gases. All right, here's a summary of the applicability criteria under Steps 1 and 2 of the tailoring rule. In the first half of 2011, no source will be subject to Title V solely as a result of its greenhouse gas emissions. Thus, new Well, there will be no new Title V sources that come into the program as a result of their greenhouse gases under Step 1. Okay, under Step 2, existing or newly constructed greenhouse gas emission sources that are not already subject to Title V will be subject to Title V if they emit or have the potential to emit that's equal to or greater than 100,000 tons per year of CO2 equivalent, and they exceed the 100 ton per year threshold that's been applied for Title V throughout the past on a mass basis. All right, this slide covers just some of the other Title V considerations that we raised as well in the guidance document. Greenhouse gas emissions reporting under the mandatory reporting rule is not currently considered an applicable requirement under EPA regulations that implement Title V. So this reporting requirement does not need to be included in the Title V permit. EPA is not changing its Title V fee regulations or requiring new fee demonstrations from the states at this time. However, permitting authorities must collect fees to cover the cost of processing Title V permits for major greenhouse gas sources. And finally, EPA's flexible permitting provisions extend also to greenhouse gas sources. Permitting authorities and permit applicants may find that PALs, alternative operating scenarios, and advanced approvals are useful when energy efficiency measures are being considered that reduce greenhouse gases. And this ends the session on Title V and other aspects of PSD implementation.